Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Loki, and first things first, let's go into build. So with Loki, I have one build. The Loki himself really is a blank canvas, and you can truly run whatever you want on him. Loki, on his base kit, really only cares about duration for second ability invisibility, which of course makes you invisible, and if you care about his fourth ability, Radial Disarm, which is a large radius AoE that CCs enemies briefly and makes them pull out their melee, increasing not only your survivability but also your KPM, as it will prevent enemies from sniping you from 50 meters away and force them to walk up to melee range, again increasing your KPM slightly. This ability doesn't work versus Eximus, and it also doesn't work versus enemies that just happen to have Overguard from effects such as Ancient Healers or Nullifiers or enemies inside Nullifier bubbles. If you do not care about Radial Disarm, then you can just drop range altogether if the helmet ability you're not using also doesn't care about range. In my case, I'm running Ensnare, so range is perfect. Though, could just swap all of the range mods for strength mods and run other buffs such as Nourish, Breach Surge, Eclipse, Roar, etc., etc. You can also freely slot whatever arcane here you want, as he doesn't necessarily need anything here. You're free to run Avenger plus Combat Discipline if you don't care about getting a full reset on your shield gate. You can run Arcane Arachne for 150% damage for your primary, secondary, and Breach Surge. You can run Arcane Rage for bonus damage on your primary, Arcane Precision for bonus damage on your secondary, the attack speed mods, etc., etc. You really can run whatever you want. You can also choose to drop either Safeguard Switch, which I wouldn't recommend, Rolling Guard, which again I wouldn't really recommend, or Constitution or Augur Message, and slot Equilibrium in one of their places. And this would allow you to also drop Arcane Energize, and now you have two full Arcane slots to just put on DPS Arcanes for your weapons. For an example, Arcane Acceleration for 90% fire rate, and Arcane Rage for 180% damage. This means at base, Loki has decent KPM potential due to being able to freely run 280% range grouping tool and full DPS arcanes. As to the weapon loadout, I was using a miter as I really liked the miter and I just really like grouping tools in conjunction with gas. I do have a really good Riven, but whenever I was doing my runs, this thing only had one form in it and I was completely missing this mod, meaning I was losing a 320% crit chance from Galvanized Scope when fully stacked, which is pretty easy to maintain. I also did a run without a Riven, using this build, again slotting Galvanized Scope and Bladed Rounds to mimic the crit damage that my Riven was giving, and it was pretty much equivalent because with my Riven I was overkilling the enemies as the damage is absurd. When this thing is fully formed out, I would probably drop Thermite rounds for something like either Amalgam's Duration for just more raw damage, Hammer Shot for more crit damage and status chance, or even something like Continuous Misery for extra status duration, so the gas clouds would linger even after the enemies died for even longer for more DPS. Other primaries that you can use, if you want to mimic gas builds, you can use something like the Latrana Karnan, which is almost identical to the Miter, and it would be just as good. You could also use something like the Paris Incarnon for a gas build. Good old Nadaruk if you don't like using Incarnon weapons. Am I trolling? I'm trolling. Use the Nadaruk as a gas build if you do not like Incarnon weapons with something like this. You'd be able to drop Vile Acceleration and replace this with whatever you want, as again, Loki can freely just run Arcane Acceleration in his Arcane slot. Or you could just run anything. Again, like with Loki, the world is your oyster. You can do whatever you want. Same thing with secondaries. I would suggest running an Epitaph for a primer. You can either run no Augur mods or Augur mods if you happen to need them to fully shield gate. You don't even really have to shield gate on them, so it's entirely up to you. Or you can run a DPS secondary such as the Gaze, the Nucor, the Latum, the Lex, the Spore Lacer, the Cycron, the Despair, the Furus, etc., etc. All of these work well. As for melees, I would just simply suggest the Praetus for the parkour velocity and sprint speed, and as for focus schools, you have a couple options here. Unaru was my go-to for Prime Sure-Footed. This lets me slot Cunning Drift instead of Prime Sure-Footed for 15% more range. It also gives access to Caustic Strike for an armor strip to have scaling potential. You could also run Moderai if you... On my build, the ability strength was pretty useless, and so was the casting speed, but depending on your subsume, Moderai could be very useful. On top of this, Phoenix Talons does increase the damage that you deal with your weapons, so running Moderai is just a damage increase over Unaru, but you do lose access to an armor strip, so you will fall off, and you will lose 15% range on the Ensnare build. Another focus school you could use is Zenric, and this would allow you to drop Energize without even needing to slot Equilibrium. Last but not least is just the Panzer with the synth mods equipped, so you never have to reload, and if you run Equilibrium, these synth mods are also a must. Now moving on to the rankings, we're discussing Loki in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly is KPM, secondly is Survivability, thirdly is Viability, and finally how fun he is to play. All this data is sampled for a 1-hour solo Steel Path bot run with no Spectres, no on-call, and of course no Archon shards. Now speaking about the first topic, Loki's KPM. I'm going to attempt to keep these sections short, as Loki is a pretty generic frame and I shouldn't have to ramble, but knowing myself, I will make this section 10 minutes long and just go on a tangent. So Loki's KPM is above average thanks to him freely being able to run any helmet you want without sacrificing the core identity of the frame, which is just a stealth frame that happens to have a decent CC tool on his 4th ability, and invincibility from his 3rd ability with the augment. Ensnare works perfectly well on him, and as anyone knows, running a high range grouping tool will always boost your KPM. It doesn't end there for Loki, however, as he also has high survivability, which I am getting ahead of myself a bit, but having high survivability does always also increase your KPM a fair bit. It doesn't end there either, as I've already mentioned in the build segment, you can freely run 2 full DPS arcanes on your Warframe, meaning that, well, you're just buffing the ever-loving crap out of your guns. You can run Arcane Arachne plus Arcane Rage for plus 330% Serration buff on any of your weapons. You can run Arcane Acceleration plus Arcane Avenger and drop Brief or Spike, get 45% flat crit and 90% fire rate, etc., etc. It works particularly well with pistols, as you can run Arcane Precision for 300% damage, and Arcane, I can't remember what the fire rate arcane's called, to get 300% damage and 120% fire rate for pistols. So just giving your weapons all of these free buffs and having high survivability plus a 280% range grouping tool, you have potential to get insanely high KPM. Take this run for instance, I got 170 170 KPM over an entire hour with no on-call, no Archon shards, and whatever the hell the other restriction is. That is absurd. To put that in perspective, that is the highest KPM I've ever gotten on any frame other than Mirage. Now you could argue I just got lucky spawns, or the Miter's just OP, but the fact of the matter is I went back and I tried other weapons. I went there with the Dread, I still got about 130 KPM. I went in with the Miter without a Riven, and I still got about 150 KPM. And I went in with the Despair, and I also got about 140 KPM. So, across the board, just due to him being able to freely buff the ever-loving crap out of your weapons while still running high-in-range Ensnare with incredibly high survivability, he gets such good KPM, just no matter what you use. So, and not only that, you can freely run Unaru for access to an armor strip to have his scaling potential. Normally, if you're only running Unaru for an armor strip for scaling, it's kind of whatever. But the fact that you're running a grouping tool plus Ensnare means that you can easily just armor strip 20 plus enemies in a single cast of Caustic Strike. So you even have scaling potential on these builds. I will give Loki an S- rank for his KPM, and you might be wondering why it's not higher. And I'll be honest, in short, it just doesn't feel right giving him a higher rank for his KPM, despite me consistently getting such high KPM with him. And I'll just leave it at that. This video is cursed, by the way, if you haven't already been able to tell. All right, moving on to the second topic of survivability. This should be short and easy. Loki survivability is absolutely insane. He has the highest survivability out of any of the invis frames. The reason for this is because his fourth ability is incredibly useful for just disarming enemies, turning them into infested enemies. It's really hard to die to an infested charger. He's invisible. That's already a plus, like I talked about in the Avara video. Like, being invisible pretty much already gives you like a guaranteed high A rank survivability. And he also has an augment that just casually gives him 3 seconds of invincibility, like Rolling Guard, but it scales with your duration mods. Meaning that with Archon shards, you can get up to like 240% duration with like a proper Archon shard build of like 1x casting speed for comfort, 1x energy, 1 to 2x energy orb efficiency to be able to drop energize, and then like 2x duration. So you'd get like 30% duration if they're Tau Forged, or if you just run 3, like 113, giving you about 237% duration. So now you have like a 7.5 second long invincibility button that you can just press, and it only costs 25 energy, by the way. And not only that, Loki's base shields are incredibly low, so you can very easily shield gate even with a 25 cost ability without sacrificing anything on your main build. Like you've noticed, I'm just running Brief Respite, Augur Message, and Augur Reach, and that is enough to shield gate on him with a 25 cost ability. You're literally giving up nothing except for your aura, because you'd be running the 2 Augur mods anyway. So his survivability is just insane. Not only that, a lot of people probably don't know this, but you can cast Switch Teleport on enemies that have Overguard. So even if you're panicking and you're like, oh crap, my shield gate's broken, or oh crap, I'm out of my invisibility, I'm about to die, you can just look at any enemy and pressure 3, and you'll reset your shield gate, and then a quarter of a second later, be invincible for 7 seconds. That is absurd. I am giving him an S rank for his survivability, and honestly, even that might be underselling it. Now moving on to the third topic is viability, and his viability is also pretty decent. Pretty much in every game mode, he's at the very least above average. I don't think he's the best anywhere. He's definitely not the best anywhere. But everywhere across the board, he's slightly above average. In Spy, which is probably the most irrelevant, but we'll talk about it anyway, he's a top 5 Warframe. Titania, Wukong, Limbo, Ivara, Octavia, and then Loki are like the best spy frames in the game, and then the order will just shift depending on who you ask or what spy they're doing. Outside of that, like standard game missions like Exterminate, Rescue, Capture, etc., he's decent there because he has higher base sprint speed, and you can pretty easily just drop Cunning Drift and run like a parkour mod or a sprint speed mod to go even faster. So in those mods, he's decent. He's also invisible, which makes those missions a breeze, obviously. So then you don't have potential of randomly dying if it's like a Steel Path mission, or even if it's not a Steel Path mission and you're just a newer player. Like, being invisible is amazing. So, and then there's Disruption. A lot of people will be like, oh, he's trash in Disruption because Ashe exists. But even there, the fact of the matter is, you could make an argument for Loki being better than Ashe in Disruption. Because if you're not just trying to run a gimmick meme build and a level cap run, you can just run something like the Fenmore, or any of the 50 different weapons that can kill level cap with no effort whatsoever. The only reason that Ashe is good for Disruption is if you're new to the game mode, don't have fully modded out weapons, or if you're trying out meme builds that are honestly pretty bad, but they only work because of Ashe's passive, or because of Ashe buffing them with 150% crit chance. But Loki's second ability having a higher duration than Ashe's does give him a slight edge during something like Energy Drain and Disruption. So even in Disruption, he's one of the better frames to play. So that means that across the board, he's really good. In pretty much every game mode, he's good for new players. So I will give him an A+ for his viability as well. Now moving on to the final topic, his fun, and this is where he struggles a bit, as in my opinion, he's just kind of plain and generic. That being said, you do have a lot of build variety, as I mentioned at the start of the video. You can pretty much run whatever helmet you want. Like, you can run Breach Surge, you can run Roar, you can run Eclipse, Nourish. Literally anything. Ensnare, pull, whatever you want to run, he can run. You want to run Gloom, even though he already has incredibly high survivability, go for it. Like, it will work. So, he at least has that going for it. On top of that, you can also run a million different weapon loadouts. So, he has that, but his actual gameplay itself is pretty lackluster in my opinion. There's not really too much going on. Oh, one thing, you might have noticed in this video, my screen is randomly turning like a weird greenish brown color. If you don't want this happening to you, make sure that you have color correction turned off under your graphic settings. I noticed that after the run. Um, if that wasn't a thing, like if your screen just always turned like that ugly brownish green whenever you were invisible as Loki, I would deduct some points off of his fun, but that was just a skill issue on my part of not having color correction turned off in my graphic settings. That being said, he's just generic. He has a lot of build variety. I will give him a flat B for his fun rank. In conclusion, Loki is an A+ tier Warframe, and I feel like I'm lying through my teeth as I say this, but the stats don't lie, and I refuse to elaborate further, so I'm just going to end the video here.